Welcome into the tasting room. As always, we're glad you're here. One of the most endearing things for me about the whiskey hobby is learning the history of each of these distilleries. And few have a history as colorful as Nelson's Greenbrier.
Welcome to Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery. My name is Jacob Nelson, and I'll be walking through our history production doing the tasting. So let's get started. As we head into our Hall of History here, I'll be standing on this left wall with all these portraits, so make sure you can see that as you head on in. Now, our main player is a gentleman named Charles Nelson. Charles Nelson was born on the 4th of July, 1835 in Hagenau, Germany. His father, J.P. Nelson, decided in 1850 he wanted to move his family to America. So J.P. had all the Nelson's wealth transferred to gold. He had all the gold sewn into the lining of his suit so it's on his person at all times, and I think, great idea. I would love to have a suit made of gold, don't we all? Absolutely. So 1850, the Nelsons board the Helena Sloman. She was one of Germany's first steamships. However, she's bringing the Nelsons across, tragedy does strike. Atlantic hurricanes batter the ship, and unfortunately some people go overboard, one of those people being Charles Nelson's father, J.P. Nelson, with the worst life jacket in the world. Suit made of gold. Drags him to the bombing Atlantic. It's the last we hear of J.P. Nelson. It is an incredibly sad start to our story. But I guarantee it's going to get better. If you wear some whiskey later, always helps. 2 weeks later, the Nelsons arrive in New York City. And at 15 years old, Charles Nelson has now become the head of the household. Luckily for Charles Nelson, no child labor laws, but unluckily for Charles Nelson, no child labor laws. So he does get a job, but he's working incredibly long hours, very little pay, poor working conditions, but he still provides for his family. And 2 years later, when he finally has enough money saved up, he decides he wants to move his family again to a little town called Porkopolis. Some people have called it Cincinnati, Ohio. I have never called it Cincinnati, Ohio a day in my life. I've always called it Porkopolis. I expect y'all will too. But Porkopolis back then was providing 27% of the nation's pork product, which is where they got their nickname, Porkopolis. So Charles Nelson gets a job as a butcher. But working as a butcher, he noticed some of the pigs he got were bigger than the rest, and he asked why. Well, it's because those pigs were fed from the spent mash that came from distillers. So he started talking to these distillers. He befriended them. He learned the process of making whiskey, found it fascinating. So in 1858, he decided to move his family one more time. Nashville, Charles Nelson owned a grocery store. What was then Market Street, what is now 2nd Avenue. And if you go down to 2nd Avenue, you would see the same facade of the building you see in this picture right here. Now, this grocery store was a wholesale grocery store, but Charles Nelson was known for 3 main products: coffee, meat, and whiskey. Whiskey was by far his best seller. The small little one-room distillery that he contracted the distillation out from up in Green Brier, Tennessee, which is about 20 miles north of here, they could no longer keep up the demand. So in 1870, Charles Nelson decided to outright buy the distillery and ramp up production to the level he wanted. He buys it his meat and coffee provider, he turns the grocery store into his bottling warehouse and his office, and he turns that small one-room distillery into a huge campus the size of a small town. Now this right here was the original distilling crew. We have Charles Nelson in the bottom right corner, his son William right next to him, and this gentleman right here. This man's name is Mr. Henry Bollinger. Now he's going to play a very important role in the story. I'm going to get to him in just a second. But now it's 1870. Charles Nelson now owns the distillery, he's ramping up production, and at this time he starts outselling his nearest competitor 16-1. So if you're drinking Tennessee whiskey, you are drinking Charles Nelson's Tennessee whiskey. There's a reason for that. Besides making outstanding whiskey that everybody loves, he's doing things most people haven't seen at this point. He sold his whiskey like this, a glass bottle. That's shocking, I know. You've never seen glass bottle whiskey before. Of course you have. It's a modern day standard, or a plastic bottle. Back when in college, money's tight, but glass is a modern day standard. Well, back then it wasn't. Now, it was not impossible to find a glass bottle whiskey back then. They did exist, but they weren't very common. Your more common way to find your whiskey, a 53-gallon barrel weighs about 500 pounds. Try to roll that home, try to explain to your spouse why you spent half a year's worth of wages on whiskey. It's gonna go over great, I'm sure. Ceramic jug, still kind of heavy, kind of awkward to carry. So probably the most common way of buying your whiskey was a traveling salesman. They're going around, they'd walk up to you, they say, hey, would you like to try some whiskey? And you would say, it's 1870, there's nothing else to do. Please pour some alcohol. So he would take his jug of whiskey, he'd pour you a little sample, you'd taste it, go, that's delicious, makes me forget about the dysentery, I'd love some whiskey. Let me go in the back, I'll grab my jug, I'll give it to you and you fill it up. So he would take your jug. He'd walk out to his horse-drawn carriage where he's got a 53-gallon barrel, but the funny thing about a 53-gallon barrel is you can't see what's in it. And some of these traveling salesmen take advantage of that. Because you didn't know what was in their barrel, they're not putting whiskey in their barrel. What they were putting in their barrel could have been the head of whiskey. The head of whiskey is methanol alcohol. And we have a saying here, if it contains the word meth, do not put it in your body. Methanol alcohol doesn't taste like whiskey, doesn't look like whiskey. They had to add sugar to it, make it a little bit more palatable, then they had to dye it to make you think it was whiskey. They're adding prune juice, iodine, lamp oil, shoe polish, the ever so delicious tobacco spit. Don't you want some tobacco spit and methanol alcohol? People are getting sick from this. They're going blind, they're dying, and that's where these terms, blind drunk and dead drunk. It comes from these salesmen, doesn't matter to them, you're never going to see them again. Because they're blind. And they're off somewhere else selling that soul to another person. Well, Charles Nelson decided made it a bit easier to sell whiskey. The person can see the bottle grabbing and still be like to drink it, so he sold his whiskey like this. First, he puts his name on it, Nelson's Green Brier Tennessee whiskey, so you knew to go to if you got sick. You're not getting sick drinking this, it's made properly. Next, that's a bit easier to take home than a 53-gallon barrel. You got the glass, you can see what's in there, you know it's whiskey, you know it's the same every single time, and he sealed the top of it so you know it isn't tampered with when you bought that bottle. That is why he started outselling his nearest competitor 16-1, and that is where Mr. Henry Bollinger comes into play. Mr. Henry Bollinger was the distillery foreman for Charles Nelson. So Charles Nelson asked him to give an interview with a newspaper to state the exact recipe and process of how they made the Nelson's Green Brier. Now, if we did that today, we'd be insane, that's absolutely crazy, but today you don't have to worry about the whiskey you're drinking. Back then you did. How do you build consumer confidence at a time where people are dying from their drinking? You tell them exactly what they're going to be drinking. They were obsessed with the transparency, the accountability, and people realized that. The demand for their whiskey was so great, they were producing just around 2 million bottles per year in the 1800s, a level we are still trying to get to this day. Now, the height of his career, 1891, 56 years old. Charles Nelson gets sick. He passes away. But again, he does something nobody else would really consider, and he gives the day-to-day operations to his wife, Louisa Nelson. She starts running the largest distillery of Tennessee whiskey, and she does it better than Charles Nelson. By the time she's run the distillery, we see bottles appear all over the world. France, Russia, the Philippines, Australia, international company was being run by a woman at a time she didn't have rights in her own country. In fact, she couldn't walk into a bar by herself and order her own Nelson's Green Brier. She had to have a man on unarmed people do that, otherwise she was going to jail, and she didn't care. She was going to continue on that business as best she could. In fact, in 1906, she was able to receive the trademark for the label that we are still using to this day. She is one of the first women in history to receive a trademark. An outstanding woman. But she does start to notice something. Talks, whispers, something's changing in the country, something's right around the corner. Prohibition is coming up. In fact, Tennessee started statewide prohibition 10 years early, 1909. Now for the Nelsons, once prohibition was enacted here in the state, well, they just moved on to other things. They owned banks, hospitals, schools, but if people found out they'd been involved in alcohol, it was so embarrassing. At this point in history, the Nelsons were afraid they may have just been kicked out of society. They didn't tell their children about their own family history. Essentially, the story dissolves down to, well, there's just an old moonshine grandfather in the family. And if you're from the South, you've most likely got an old moonshine grandfather from the family. I can almost guarantee that. By the time that nationwide prohibition was enacted, the Nelson story had already been completely forgotten for about 100 years. And that's where these two brothers come into play. This is Andy and Charlie Nelson. 2006. They were history and philosophy majors going to college in California. But they're back home here in Nashville, summer break. They're talking to their dad. Their dad tells them he needs their help because he just ordered like half a cow's worth of meat from a butcher in a little town called Greenbrier. I know. They're driving Greenbrier, their father, stopped at a gas station, noticed this, a historical marker. Now, being history and philosophy majors, they have to read every historical marker. Maybe there's a test coming up, who knows? They start reading it, and they see 1 mile east on Long Branch, Charles Nelson opened Greenbrier Distillery in 1870, and Charlie Nelson sees his full name, Charles Nelson, on the sign. Charlie is a bright guy, but he doesn't recall owning a distiller in 1870. So he turns to their father, goes, "Dad, who's Charles Nelson? Does that have anything to do with that old moonshine grandfather we had?" And their dad says, "I don't know much about family history. Charles Nelson, that's a pretty common name. I highly doubt it. But let's go and talk to the butcher. He's lived here his entire life. Maybe he knows something." They go down, they talk to the butcher. The butcher tells him, because of Charles Nelson, Greenbrier exists. He points right across the street where the original barrel warehouse is still standing to this day. He tells them to go walk the grounds. They go over there, walk the grounds, and say they felt something in the air telling them there's more to this story. So they went back home. They started calling extended family, asking if anybody knew their family history, and they had a little bit here and there, but it wasn't enough. So eventually they decided to go on Ancestry.com, and they found out they are the great, great, great grandsons of Charles and Louisa Nelson, the direct descendants. So now they have to know the full story. They go back up to the Historical Society of Robertson County, and for those historians who work there, who've dedicated their entire lives to knowing the history of the area, when the Nelsons walked the door, it was like history walked the door itself. They started pulling out boxes upon boxes of mash bills, grain receipts, advertisements, old pictures. They had the trademark Mrs. Louisa made of that label. They had the newspaper article Mr. Henry Bollinger wrote with the exact recipe. They had 2 intact pre-Prohibition bottles from the time they were smashing bottles. The fact you can get your hands on intact glass 100-plus-year-old bottles is absolutely insane. They took those bottles and they had them 3D scanned, so this is the exact bottle, the exact label, the exact whiskey as it was in the 1800s. This is history in my hands. Not only that, but Nelson's Greenbrier Tennessee whiskey predates any other Tennessee whiskey recipe by 7 years. This is the original Tennessee whiskey, and it is back after 110 years. It's my favorite part of the tour. So, when we look at this list, we're going to see there's a whole bunch of names and numbers all over it, but we definitely noticed we highlighted that number 5. Well, that number 5 was our original DSP number. DSP stands for Distilled Spirits Plant. It's the registration for your distillery, and that is a single-digit pre-Prohibition DSP number. Something we're very proud of here, because before Prohibition, Tennessee alone, there are hundreds of distilleries going up to at least a 600-plus number, and you might even recognize another distillery sitting on here. Not 7, but 514. And we were number 5. Now, after Prohibition, all DSPs countrywide, they all reset them back to 1, and that number is over 30,000 now countrywide. All of these are now post-Prohibition DSP numbers. But when Charlie and Andy went to the government to open this facility to get their DSP, because they could prove their direct lineage Charles and Louisa, had the original trademarks, the original recipe, and for some reason the government never reassigned the number 5 Tennessee DSP. The government gave them back the original single-digit pre-Prohibition DSP number, which is also something very proud of here, because the only other distilleries in the country that I am personally aware of that still retain and operate under their original pre-Prohibition DSP number, there's one in Kentucky, it is Peerless, the number 50, and George Washington's, which is so old they just use the year 1792. We are incredibly proud to have a single-digit pre-Prohibition DSP number, put all of our distillery, put all of our merchandise. In fact, if you look on the bottom of our bottles, we etched it into the bottom of the bottle, showed just how proud we are to retain that number to this day, and show honor Charles and Louisa for everything they did as well. But that does catch us up to our present day and ends the history portion of our tour.
Tennessee DSP number 5. That's a pretty solid claim to the title of original Tennessee whiskey. If you're ever in the Nashville area, the tour at Nelson's Greenbrier is a must-do. And if you happen to make it by there, tell them you saw him here on the Tasting Room Show. Either way is cool. Remember, we want you to drink what you like.